Okay, well, thanks for being here today, everybody. We've got a nice, intimate conversation on quantum entanglement theology, things that I know very little about, but our esteemed panel is going to really give us some great information, I think, and I'm looking forward to a really great discussion. So we have Bob Russell, Phil Clayton, and Hyung-Ju Lee, and they're each going to have about 20 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions. We might take a break in the middle, so if the video gets a little choppy at one point, you'll know why. This has really been the impetus of CTNS supporter Chick Darpino, who was sort of interested in the intersection of these questions that sort of led to the gathering that we have here today. And we're sorry that he's not here in person, but we'll be engaging with conversation with him after
Thank you, Chick.
Yes.
Thanks.
Amen.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Well, let me just say, I went back through this wonderful book and found it really good.
Show it to the camera there.
Yeah.
What an achievement.
The fifth in our Volume 5 series on science pollution.
This was the last one?
This is the last
I
one.
mean, other than the capstone.
Number 5.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I have a 2-page handout, and I'm just going to walk us through it. I found a really nice video from Kate Mackey. Here's a quote from her. Does the wave function at one spot collapse? Or maybe the particle is actually in all those different places? So that's kind of one of the fundamental logical questions, right? And if it really does stay in all those places, to put it kind of crudely, that'd be a real challenge to classical realism. So that's part of this. Okay, the basics of quantum entanglement. First, I'll just note that almost all the time you hear me talk about the collapse of the wave function. And that's kind of the simplest case of entanglement in the sense that it requires a collapse, but nothing more. Whereas entanglement requires effects between particles when they are or not collapsing. So it's kind of a more complicated version of collapse per se. And there's kind of 2 or 3 different levels of entanglement. So even that much is a complicated issue. So the most simple one that we all use for basic entanglement, even just for basic collapse, is photons in the 2-slit experiment. There's a reference there. I've been able to look at it. So you shine a beam of photons through the double slit and collect them on the screen. The pattern is dots described like a diffraction pattern with interference fringes. So the diffraction pattern is that big wave like that. Interference fringes are all the little bands in it. Okay. Which slit does the photon go through? If the photon is just a tiny particle, a classical particle, then it's got to go through 1 of 2 slits. Well, one way to find out is close to the slit. And if you do that, you lose the interference fringes. You keep the diffraction. So you keep the wave-like particle property, but you lose this extra piece to it, which is the fringy pattern of self-interference. Okay. Classical explanation, it's impossible. You can try, but it's essentially we tried and we don't really have one. So let's just say it's impossible. I mean, the diamond world reals will argue with that, but that's fine. Quantum explanation, I usually take the Bohr-Copenhagen interpretation. Unlike classical physics, we cannot give a causal explanation of the space-time description. So that's a really loaded sentence for something really actually quite simple. If I throw a football down into you and you take a picture of it, you can stop the picture in the air and you can say, okay, here is the football at time 1, and it's moving in that direction, and there's a force of gravity down on it. Put that into Newton's equation, you can solve for the parabola you get. So that's a good example that you can place a causal explanation into a space-time description. And it's as simple as that, but it's profound intuition. Now the question is, would that hold for quantum particles? Does it hold all the way down? Or is that itself some sort of emergent simplification of what's happening lower down? And that's probably the way I'd go. So that's why I say, unlike classical physics, we cannot give a causal explanation of the space-time description. You can give the space-time description in terms of the path. You can give a causal explanation in terms of the wave function, but you can't put them together. So you can't imagine that gravity in a quantum mechanical phenomenon, gravity acts, or the forces act like gravity does that it forces the trajectory to curve. Okay. Quantum superposition of wave-like and particle-like properties. This is, I call this first type entanglement. That is, in quantum mechanics, phenomena have wave-like and particle-like properties. That's a more subtle way of saying superposition than just saying you can't put a causal explanation in the space-time picture. But that's usually the way you get into it, by starting with what's obvious, space-time picture of causal properties. Okay, when you say we're packing up, can't. So, electron pairs and superposition. You start with two electrons, A and B, in a paired state. So think of helium, the helium atom has two protons, two neutrons, and two electrons in orbit. That's the kind of Bohr model of an orbit of particles, but that's the starting point. So there are two electrons. Well, they both have spin and a half. One can be spin up, one can be spin down, or the way around. But if you put a third electron in, there's no space for it, because the spin states are taken to the next orbit up, which can have up to 6. And that is, in a sense, the basis for chemical properties. I mean, it gives you chemistry in the first place. It gives you the periodic table of the elements, and it gives you the spectral lines and all that stuff, because you can't keep stuffing electrons into the same state. And that's another way of saying that superposition is a problem. You can't all pose them in the same state. They have to go into different states. So the spin of the electrons must be electron A spin up, B spin down, minus, that's the long story, A spin down, B spin up. And then you see the note on 3. Destroy the paired state, electrons travel in opposite directions to a great distance. So if the combined state is dissolved and they go off, obviously broke from each other. And then at a large distance, meaning outside their light cone, so you can't think of light as communicating between them. So it's not a causal interaction. You measure one state. You to find out now that electron A is actually state up. Then you know, even without measuring it, that electron B is in state down. So the point is, before they collapse, A could be up and B down, or A could be down and B up. After they collapse, either one is possible, but not both. And if you know, that's proven by the fact that if you know the spin of state of particle A, you can infer state B. Now, of course, the point is, what caused them to do that? How did they go from a state in which their orientations, or spins, are in a sense ambiguous, or not fully realized, because they're in both states? And you can't be in both states, classically, but you think of them that way. Two being a kind of classical situation of, I have state A, this is state, or I have spin up, this has been down, or I have spin up. Okay. And again, there's two interpretations of that. Interestingly, I got quotes from Katie on the interference argument, and I couldn't really find one on the underlying reality one, but that's the one that most people take for granted, so I'll stay here. The two interpretations of the simultaneous effect are a causal explanation, that something happens when you measure particle A and its state up, that makes the other particle B state down. So it's a causal explanation. But it can't be a causal explanation because of relativity, because it's outside the light cone. So that really doesn't work. I mean, people try it, but it's not very popular. That was Einstein's attempt to respond to this problem back in 1934. So look, it's been 80 years, and it's been around. And a lot of physicists getting a lot of Nobel Prizes that have never solved this problem. So even getting the problem out is complicated because it's so counterintuitive. You know, it took a long time to learn this stuff. This is the explanation of the video. The information in this video, quote, this information travels instantaneously faster than the light. Again, a lot of people hold that, but I don't, and I think the majority of physicists don't. We had a whole series of discussions on that in this conference, because the reason why it's problematic is because it sounds like you can have a cause and that goes faster than light. And that does violate special relativity, but relativity can be kind of finessed. You can say, well, it isn't a transfer of information in some sense. It's more like, I don't even remember, I'm sorry. There's a way in which you can kind of finesse it that at our conference back in 2001, we debated for a long time. And I think most folks wouldn't go that way. That's why I sort of say a bit superficially, you can't have actual innocence. You can have it, but you have to really argue carefully that it doesn't violate the kind of underlying meaning of social relativity. And I'm happy to try to go back and reread that part, but it's subtle. Okay. Nevertheless, that is one explanation. And I was a little bit surprised that Katie said that, because that's what most people who are kind of in what I call the wow of physics. Physics is this wonderful kind of, Eastern holographic, who knows what. That's kind of the way they talk about it, and it's not the way anyone at the conference talked about it. So I was a little surprised she said it, because she's so good. I mean, she's got into the Hawking chair at the Perimeter Institute, so she must be super tops. Anyway, but then she said she's more subtle as you go through the whole video. And it also sort of applies to a lot of folks that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that there is a better theory that will replace it eventually, which will give a better explanation. So it's not a complete theory. It's correct, but it's not complete. So if I told you what I had for lunch, it'd be true, but it wouldn't be a complete account of me. Right. And that seems so obvious for things like people, or the ordinary world, but it's hard for physicists to accept that, because if it's really incomplete, Einstein at first thought it was incorrect. That's a lot easier to say. There is a correct theory, this isn't it. But this one's saying, my theory is correct enough to be telling you something that's true. It's not incorrect, but it's not complete. And yet, 80 years later, we still don't really have its replacement. We can argue about that, but it's not really clear that we do. So, okay. What's our time?
It's easier for theologians to say things are incomplete.
The second one is this really subtle one, which I really find myself drawn to, like you can call it ontological explanation. John Bell's one example in the 60s. Bell's theory was behind all of this work. Kirk did a fabulous dissertation on quantum mechanics, and he actually derived Bell's theorem himself in a unique way and published it. And that's I mean, that's really good. He doesn't have a PhD in physics. It's just one of the most glowing things I know about Kirk's academic abilities that he did that. So Bell's theorem basically is fundamental to all this discussion, and it says, if there is a complete theory, it won't include local variables. It has to be non-local variables, some sort of already extended kind of causal connection. So it's not a cause that's transmitted, because that is forbidden by relativity. But it doesn't, relativity can't say there can't be a causal connection, just not causal in the normal sense of I throw a hoop to a football and he catches it. Okay. So what is that causal, non-local causal connection, or just non-local because people don't want to use the word cause? It always sounds like it's a transmitted energy. So you can call it ontological quantum entanglement. So it's not just quantum entanglement that A is up and B is down. It's more than that, because even when you separate them physically, so they're in different galaxies, they still seem not separated. But you can't detect what is the not separated aspect of them. It's not visible. You can't feel it. It's not like this. So why is it not just a chimera? I mean, why is it real? Well, because if you want any kind of realist explanation, then you need something to account for why they're still somehow connected. And just as an aside, I think I've said before, I went through 6 years of physics at UC Santa Cruz, and There was only one physicist in the entire community who was interested in these issues. All of them were pragmatists or anomalies or whatever. None of them were any kind of realist. In fact, I went to, when my physicist my first year was there and asked him about this very problem. He looked at me and kind of like discussed it and said, "We're not giving you enough work, are we?" He walked off. We never talked about it again. I do. So, just to get it on the table, you can consider the Deverly-Bohm interpretation as a very good example of this non-local correlation. Just really quickly, the way Bohm does it is so clever. Instead of saying you have a particle in three-dimensional space, so you need a three-dimensional picture. Well, if you have n particles, then you need a 3n-dimensional space to picture it, to picture all the properties. Or you can say you have a 3n-dimensional single vector, which rotates through 3n-dimensional space. It sounds more complicated, but it gives you a kind of picturable representation. So what Bohm does is he gives you a way to visualize the entire state function for all n particles in your problem as a 3n-dimensional vector space with one particle. And my home example was, I have a fishbowl, and I have a camera looking at the fishbowl, and it projects the fishbowl on the television screen. And in the fishbowl, you see two fish, and they're moving around, but they're always correlated. So if one fish is looking at Braden and one at Ted, if this one moves to look at Hungju, this one moves to look at Braden. They're always correlated. But you can't see any, there's no net, there's no hook, you know. They're just swimming around in the fishbowl, being happy fish. What accounts for this amazing fact? And then, of course, it takes this shade down, and you have two cameras looking at one fish from 2 points of view and projecting on two different TV screens, which are then put together on one TV screen. So you're seeing two images of one fish, not one image of two fish. So you have two images of one fish, meaning you have a 3n-dimensional single vector being looked at from all 3n directions. So our share, if that were true classically, I mean, the fact that we take for granted that we're sitting in a room and Braden's there, I'm here, and we can talk and interact, is actually a projection of there being the Braden Bob sitting in a 3n-dimensional world, which is doing Braden Bob stuff, and the cameras are taking those different aspects and projecting them into two different people, and then the question is, how are they talking? So it sort of gets at the idea, just enough that it's quasi-plausible, even though it's opposite setup. Okay, so that would be a way of saying you're not violating special relativity, because there's no signal telling Braden when he looks like this, I see him do that, and I move my head this way. Because there really aren't separate Bob and Bradens. But it doesn't account for our experience of separateness. I mean, it's just a given to me that I'm Bob and not somehow a Bob Braden, whatever that is, right? That's just a given. So the criticism is when you're constructing a more complicated explanation than the phenomenon itself is. And that's where the debate is. Okay, so.
Would that apply to David Bohm only, or to David and Kirk as well? I mean, to Bohm and Kirk as well?
I don't know Kirk on that. That's a really good question, Ted.
Yeah.
I mean.
Well, we'll ask him.
Yeah, we will. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's enough of a realist that he
Yeah.
wouldn't. But it's why I think one reason to see why people were so struck by Bohm. I mean, first of all, he's a fantastic personality. I knew him, a really amazing man, gracious man. But, and second, the real reason is because what he does is completely brilliant and plausible in a way. And yet, at the same time, it just seems so hard to believe. He really believed that it was more correct to say the universe is a 3n-dimensional vector. It's a Hilbert space. So a single vector in Hilbert space. And that somehow is rotating. Oh well. Yeah, be nice to ask Kirk. So the two electrons appear to be separate particles in space and time, which again is our fundamental experience of the world, right? I get in my car and drive it. It's assumed by everything we say. It's not a thing. But they're actually two parts of a single underlying object extended, it's a metaphor, to vast distances. It's not really extended, it's in a certain sense already there. Because there are no real vast distances any more than the images of the fish are actually fish in different bowls, where you can say, well, where are those bowls in the room? They're actually pictures on a camera. I think that's why he liked, Forms of Eastern Thought so much, because it has that kind of sense to it. And this interpretation is related to one version of the many worlds model. That's a way of saying there are n three-dimensional worlds. Then Bohm's answer is no, there's one 3n-dimensional world. So it's an interesting question of how quantum mechanics leads you, if you go that way, to actually sort of unhinging the basic experience of the world that we have as given, out of which our experience evolved. Can you think of anything, except maybe you have meditative experience or something that you do in life that doesn't presuppose an extended three-dimensional world of time? And people are separate with ethical rights and stuff. I mean, it's just such a given that it's hard to really think that you can think the way that you have to think the way if you want to give a semi-realist or pseudo-realist explanation of quantum mechanics. Okay, that's that part. Now, so where are we now? This is really my previous work, but now I've shifted my focus for the sake of this conversation. It's really interesting to have that, to the question of, collapse wave function as how does God interact with the world through that? Does God collapse it? No, it's so. To the question of superposition, and really this third kind of superposition which you get from paired particles that are separate. Okay, not just the double slit experiment, which is so straightforward. So again, I accept the theological interpretation of the quantum of the Copenhagen philosophical interpretation of quantum entanglement, and I always try to say that carefully because I'm recognizing that the Copenhagen view is a philosophical interpretation of quantum mechanics, and what I'm doing is a theological interpretation of it. Right? And I'm like always acknowledging that there are at least 8 or 10 alternative philosophical interpretations. Quantum Reality is a really nice book that he lays out each of the 8 different interpretations of quantum mechanics.
Who's the author of Quantum Reality?
Send me an email, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Oh, Herbert, Nick Herbert.
Nick Herbert, okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah.
H-E-R-B-E-R-T. It's really readable, really fun, he's brilliant. He's got it right. I think he's a mini Walzer. But one of the things I like about his book is he doesn't lay his views out there. It's really an educational tool. And it really clarifies the field. I've used it for 20 years, even in my classes. So I'm using a particular theological interpretation of a particular philosophical view of quantum mechanics, namely Copenhagen. And in particular, because there really are different ones. Bohr he wasn't an anti-realist. He gets it wrong in the issues. He says he's only talking about epistemology. He's talking about a monist ontology. Or to defend himself, Bohr would say, I can't tell what reality is like, but it's got to be such that reality is like it seems to us macroscopically. So he can say something about the quantum reality because it's got to be that in which, under the limits of h bar goes to 0, like in relative speed light goes to 0, you get the classical world. So we're kind of a lowercase complication of what the world really is. So he's a realist in that sense. But he's not a realist in the sense that they're hidden variables and running around doing things. Okay. So that's Heisenberg's. I'm using Heisenberg's ontological determinism. I'm not using Bohr's version. I am using Heisenberg, who says we do know something about the quantum world. It is ontologically indeterministic.
So Bohr is only He's not ontological, but Heisenberg is. Is
Yes,
that what you-
yes.
Okay, go ahead.
And they call them both co-monogamy because, well, I mean, they work so much together, and that's kind of
Yeah.
a very silly reason for calling that. Bohr really was the philosopher. Heisenberg really wasn't. But he's close to Bohr's in taking the quantum mechanical formalism seriously, and then he gives a specific philosophical interpretation drawing upon Aristotle, who talks about potential and actual. And what Heisenberg said is, for example, when you measure the wave function, you get A, not B. You've collapsed the wave function, meaning you've gone from a potential form of existence in which all possibilities are actual, or they're functioning, to a state of existence in which only one of those is left. Now, he can't tell you why you get that one, instead of the sister next door or the brother next door. But he does say, they're all there potentially, and then one of them gets
Yeah,
actualized. He can't tell you how it gets actualized, otherwise he'd have causal explanation. So it's not really causal, that's why he's not a full-blown realist, but he's more of a realist than Bohr, who would simply say, you've gone too far, Heisenberg, but you can say that potential actual transition in quantum mechanics does tell you something about the world. It tells you that it has to result in the classical world, where you do have these properties, in unambiguous properties, like I'm sitting in this chair, not that chair. It's unambiguous. Okay. So anyway, I'm really following Heisenberg, which to support a view of divine action in which God acts together with natural causality to bring about double quantum entanglement. Together with is my plea for mercy. I don't know how it sounds. I do not collapse primary causality into secondary causality. I'm accused of that by all my beloved followers, but they get it wrong. I do not intend to do that. And I don't usually use the primary and secondary because that's usually co-opted by the Dominicans because they follow Aristotle so closely. But I do like to use that kind of to get the conversation started. That God is active in the collapse of the wave function in a way in which, as Kirk pointed out in his paper on it, you can either say Bob means God determines when the wave function collapses, or Bob determines that it collapses to A versus B. But if you say both, then you have God as a secondary cause. Or it's too close to making God into a secondary cause. But there's a little thin wedge, which everybody misses about Bob, thank you, Kirk, that he's not combining those two. He's saying, and I'm never really clear about this because I never thought about it until Kirk wrote his book, that, I mean, in his paper, in his book, that there's a difference between God determining that the uranium atom decayed now instead of 5 minutes from now, so that had happened now, or saying God determined that this uranium atom would decay, not that one, versus saying God determined that this uranium atom, not that one, would collapse now, not later. That's kind of too strong, and I think that's a really insightful point of view. Yeah, that's in my growing list, making a list of things I want to do in the next 5 years before I lose my mind entirely. In my growing list, that's one of the main things. It's really fine-tune that, see what if I can get a better way of saying that. So God remains God, but God's primary causality, to use the old Pastor term, is richer than we think of. It's rich enough to be able to either act through what happens when or what happens to which, instead of necessarily combining the two. I can't lift a pencil without lifting it now. I can't lift a pencil without lifting this pencil now. Otherwise, I haven't lifted a pencil. And Kirk pointed it out. So, it is best understood as what Chick refers to as double agency. I tend to shy away from the term double agency because it sounds like exactly what I don't want to be accused of. That I don't want to be saying, well, one agent is the uranium atom, so the other agent, I'm using the same word, is God, because then they're both agents. What's different? But it's fine. I mean, you can call it double agency as long as you let me say, I'm using it to ascribe agency to two fundamentally different things. One, God, right, the transcendent God, creator of the universe, the Trinitarian God. And second, agency amongst God's creation. And so it's double agency, yes. If you allow me to say that I'm trying to hide the difference in the single term agency, instead of making it clear in the two terms for what's acting. So, okay, good. God is present to all events in space-time. I think I'm almost out of time, I'm sorry. In their individual state of being present, each with its own past and future. That's my time and eternity idea. God acts in light of such divine providence, continuous creation, and with their quantum mechanical properties, and the light limitations, and the collapse wave function to bring about the spin correlations either A or B. The result, new form. Now this is nice. Katie again brought this up. There are new forms of natural processes that depend upon quantum mechanics and allow for the development of new forms of technology. You know, like atomic clocks and stuff. That's the thing we really haven't thought a lot about. Usually, divine action in nature is given it a role in evolution, and that's of course key. But here, God's actually also setting up the physical world to be able to produce things, technologies that we never thought of before. And that's a novel notion of divine creation in the physics of the world, not just in the biology of the world. Okay, so I want to thank Katie for pointing that out and keep that in mind. And then, anyway, yes, now again, the chick's interest allows God to cause guidance, if you want, to result in life consciousness, moral capacity, and Homo sapiens. And this includes multiple forms of ETI, and thus a search for them, and the attempt to signal on many, because chicken said, well, does this help at all with the question of why we do SETI and many? I'm saying, well, yeah, it broadens my claim that God acts in the world such that that's part of what we do to find out about the world. We do at SETI, see if God only acts on earth or not, and many. Goes back to your original book on
Well, I'm just glad you've got room for God creating aliens.
Yeah.
You know, I feel a lot better now.
well, me and alien, I can imagine. Where are we going? Okay, this is again, this is me talking to myself. You're very kind, but let me take us to airspace. Meeting the challenge of natural evil, addressing the challenge of Eddie and SETI, incorporating new themes for new Christology in light of eschatology, and that's where I'm so delighted that Jules doing this dissertation. It's been a blessing in my life to have him say to me, you know, you raised, when you did your PhD in the 70s, then it was assumed that what you see about the universe is true of the whole universe. So it'd be crazy, I think it isn't. And what you see is a freezer-fry scenario. It's very simple. The only cause is gravity. That's it. Which means you don't want to have that be the future. You're going to have to violate physics, and here I'm supposed to be teaching for credit. So it's so wonderful that Jew has taught me that, you know, people who are getting their PhDs currently in the last few years see that it's much more complicated. And, you know, we'll see in your paper how it is in your dissertation. But it's a liberation for me to find out that I don't have to be weeping over the universe, because I've been doing it for 50 years because I didn't know what to say as a Christian. I can't just can eschatology like Goldman did. I mean, I saw what we was. No. I mean, long story. The point is I own that problem. It's my driving problem. It's always been my driving problem. And what Joe is doing, and I'm enjoying so much reading it, is realizing that there can be really different scenarios for our future in which it could be a new way for God to create something new out of existing matter. You don't have to say matter is it, there's no future. You don't have to say God tossed away the universe and creates a second one. So it's ex vetera. And that's really it. Okay, thanks. So I'm Jim.
Can I get in a really quick question?
Yeah.
When you're dealing with this issue of primary and secondary
Yeah.
causation, right in there, are you thinking like a compatibilist or incompatibilist?
Well, I'm basically an incompatibilist. I mean, Kant doesn't.
Mm-hmm. No, that's what I thought.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to be dogmatic about it. I just think it takes our experience more seriously than Kant allows me to. But the whole questions have been kind of transcended too. So it's
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not a very helpful distinction.
So when you work with the idea that God works with natural processes,
Yes.
you don't mean that in a compatibilist way.
Well, that's a really good point, Ted. That's why I kind of get myself all strung out in this paper by trying to say, well, once you have creatures capable of some sort of free will, then, yeah, I'm probably a compatibilist, because otherwise I don't see how to make it make any sense. But, and I.
It's not a bad club to belong to.
No, I like it. I mean, I'm Ted Luther too. And of course, we talked about it a lot. So I guess what I want to say is, maybe it makes a dumb answer, but that the distinction isn't necessary until you get sentient life. And then, yeah, it probably in those actions where sentient life is causing something to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, you have to say
Mhm.
God acts as a compatibilist way of acting in, with, and through, right? Like you do in Canaan. But for all those rest of the universe.
Right.
isn't it?
I don't want to drag this out, but I think sentient life taking action is a causal factor.
Yes.
Therefore, you could be an incompatibilist and hold that position.
Okay.
But I'm not going to recommend it, I just think you
No,
could.
it's interesting, I want to hear it.
Yeah.
But no, I think when I come to intelligent life acting freely, of course, I'm with you. But I think God acts into that, so it's got to be
Yeah.
compatibilist.
Mhm.
That's why I'm hoping the distinction doesn't really have to be there. But
Yeah,
it's not-
okay.
this is just a report card, just saying. So I'm not-
This is great, Robert.
Thank you.
Good summary.
Oh, thanks.
I do have a quick question. We can say it might be better to answer it after we've heard from everybody, but in your discussion there, Bob, I was wondering, would Bohm say that communication or interaction between many universes would be impossible? Because at least the way you were describing it, it seemed that there could be no way for different universes to interact with one another. If it's just one 3N
Right.
multiverse.
Thank you. Okay, let me make a distinction. I appreciate that. Because the word multiverse or multiverse is used in lots of different cases. I was speaking in the strictly quantum mechanical case, not the astronomical.
Okay.
When we say many universes, we mean other whole cosmos besides our cosmos, not other galaxies in this cosmos. But in the quantum mechanical case, it simply means you can't think of the entanglement problem in terms of signaling. When you measure this particle and it's up, nothing sends a signal faster than light to this particle to say be down. So in that technical sense, the entanglement issue doesn't help with the question of contacting EI faster than the speed of light, or getting there faster than light. I don't see it helping. It's a good question, I don't see it helping, but that's only in the sense of the quantum mechanical notion of entanglement and collapsing the wave function. So, in short, there's no, sorry, I showed that there's dispute on this. I mean, Katie actually defends the other point of view, that they really are somehow connected, but by signal. I'm sorry, they are connected by signal for the first view. Whereas I'm taking the second view, they're connected ontologically. And then I have to be honest, because there's no evidence of it. They're obviously way out there. Okay. So, but the one thing I don't think any of us are saying, Katie or anybody else talking about, is that they're sending signals faster than light. Because that just flies in the face relatively. If that helps. Okay. There you go.
Bravo, Bob, thanks.
Thanks for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to give a talk before you. I was excited when Bob asked me first to address the question. The question was, what would remain when quantum mechanics is surpassed scientifically, and how is this relevant to our theme today? That was the question given to me. I was so excited because I realized that this question is highly related to one of the central topics in my dissertation I'm now actively working on. So I decided to review some of the work in my dissertation in advance to answer this question. And I think this is totally appropriate because I have all my dissertation committee members here.
Oh,
We can dispatch you right now.
yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing, technically.
Save you trip up.
That sounds great to me.
That's okay.
And I have an obligation to inform them of what I'm doing in my dissertation well before my defense. And I think Bob asked me to address this question in the context of the research that the CTNS did with the Vatican Observatory decades ago, actually. As you all know, as contributors yourselves, they achieved a wonderful result through their research and ended up with 5 volumes about scientific perspective on divine action. And at the end of the last volume I brought here, and also Bob brought, Bob put an appendix at the end of the volume with the title Directions for Future Research on Quantum Physics, Its Philosophical Implications, and Their Relevance for Divine Action. So here it is. And my question is, what is this? I realized that that's exactly today's topic. But I'd like to ask this question to Bob. Why was such an important topic put only as an appendix? And I guess the reason was that it had mathematical equations that might not look so attractive to most theologians. However, those mathematical equations could play a crucial role in answering the questions like the one given to me. Maybe this was why Bob didn't take them out of this volume, but at least put them in the appendix. For this reason, I decided to begin with that appendix to answer the question given to me. Even though it focuses on the transition, the appendix focuses on the transition from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, rather than on the transition from quantum mechanics to post-quantum mechanics, I found a clue there on how to answer the question given to me. Let me be more specific about what it says. It looks into the structure of the Schrödinger equation to identify the origin of the quantum nature we see now. And according to Bob's explanation there, it was David Bohm, and also he already introduced the work of David Bohm, who tried to interpret quantum mechanics in the framework of classical mechanics, which is totally deterministic. That's how Bohm interprets quantum mechanics as having a deterministic nature rather than an indeterministic nature. And Bohm found out that we could transform the Schrödinger equation into the form of Newton's law of motion by introducing an additional potential, which he called the quantum potential. And one thing I noticed from Bohm's formulation as a physicist is that the Schrödinger equation is not much different from the equation for classical physics in terms of mathematics. However, that small difference, namely introducing the quantum potential, which might look negligible, changed how we depict the world dramatically. How? From the classical world to the quantum world. This does not mean that the description of classical physics became invalid. This never means that. The quantum potential is small, almost negligible, compared to the classical potential, which is dominant. Thus, in most cases, classical mechanics, even without a quantum potential, worked well without any problem. But at the same time, in some areas, it led to astonishing phenomena that could never be explained by classical mechanics, as Bob already discussed in the previous talk. In those areas, the quantum world turned out to be something that could not even be imagined in the classical world. Let me ask all of you here, once again, the question that was originally given to me by Bob. What would remain when quantum mechanics is surpassed scientifically? And how is this relevant to our themes today? Let me give you an answer. In most areas, almost everything described by quantum mechanics will remain the same. Why? Because the correction terms for the post-quantum mechanics, if any, must be negligible. Why? Because the Schrödinger equation already turned out to work extremely well even without such terms. This means the post-quantum potential, if any, should be small enough, and in most cases, its effect should be negligible. However, it's not the end of the story. We should remember that at least in some areas, the quantum world that arose from adding a seemingly negligible quantum potential produced phenomena that cannot be understood from the perspective of classical world. And those phenomena required both philosophical and theological discussions. Think about the double slit experiment, the electron pairs and superposition, and the quantum entanglement that Bob discussed briefly today. And I expect Philip would even suggest how this phenomena could extend our horizon to extraterrestrial intelligence or some other things, if any. Obviously, they produced both philosophical and theological themes that we are discussing today now. No one has ever imagined such phenomena, and their implications that we are discussing now before the discovery of quantum mechanics. And I assume this should be true of any post-quantum mechanics theory, if any. Then we should remind ourselves how hard it is to imagine what a post-quantum mechanics theory would actually be like without any clear empirical data to work on today. That's why I'm giving you a broad explanation rather than a technical detail of it. I think this broad explanation is more relevant than any specific detail for our theme today. Of course, I would be happy to give a more detailed picture of what I could expect from the post-quantum mechanics theory by introducing some technical terms in physics. If you're interested in it, and ask questions in the Q&A session. But even without going into that detail, we could expect it might shake the backbones of philosophy and theology. Recall how much mechanical philosophy by Descartes, firmly grounded on classical physics, was challenged by the arrival of quantum mechanics, and how this affected traditional assertions in Christian theology. And let me move to the topic that I'm currently working on in my dissertation, to give you another example. I'm asking myself in my dissertation the same questions, not only for quantum mechanics, but also for general relativity, Einstein's general relativity, to speculate what would happen to the evolution of the universe if it had something beyond the current cosmology that was derived from general relativity. What would remain when general relativity is surpassed scientifically? And how is this relevant to theology? Cosmologists recently found out that we could make the cosmological constant indication of general relativity, also known as dark energy, which is responsible for the expansion of the universe, dynamic, by adding a specific term to the potential of the original equation of general relativity. This new form of dark energy, varying in space and time due to the dynamics of the quantum field, is called quintessence among cosmologists. This could be thought of as a sort of quantum field dynamics added to the original general relativity. To me, this could be seen as adding a small quantum potential to the dominant classical potential, which is remarkably similar to what Bohm did to identify the quantum nature from the Schrödinger equation. As was the case in the transition from Schrödinger to Bohm, adding a term induced from quantum field dynamics to the potential of the equation that describes the dynamics of the universe should make only little difference to the dynamics of our universe, at least currently. Why? This should be only a second-order effect, as was the effect from quantum mechanics to classical mechanics, and as should be the effect from post-quantum mechanics to quantum mechanics, if any. In most cases, in most areas, I would say, we see nothing different. We see the same universe, even if we have this post-general relativity potential. However, I realized from looking carefully into the equation with the new potential that if some specific condition is given to the new potential, it could dramatically change the far future of the universe in principle. Let's go back a little bit. According to the standard Big Bang cosmology, the fate of our universe has already been determined. Why and how? Because general relativity is a deterministic theory. It's not a quantum theory, it's a classical theory. Unfortunately, the fate of the universe seems hopeless, according to the equation for general relativity, which is supposed to describe the evolution of the universe in a deterministic way. The universe will cool down to the extent that nothing but fundamental particles will survive in the far future. But if we add some terms to the potential in that equation, assuming the existence of a specific quantum field with some specific condition, the dynamics of the quantum field could change the history of the universe.
Could I just interrupt with a clarification? Is this addition anything like Einstein's lambda?
Yes, exactly.
It is, okay, okay, go ahead.
So I'm exactly talking about the lambda
All right.
cosmological
Okay.
constant. I forgot what I was talking about. But maybe
I'm sorry to
that's fine.
disturb you.
Maybe I think I was talking about the dynamics. Yeah, the dynamics of the quantum field could change the history of the universe. That's what I said. Yeah, a little for now, but eventually, they might change the future of our universe in a way that could not be imagined without it. There are two important aspects of adding such field dynamics into the original equation of general relativity. First, the equation that describes the dynamics of the universe becomes indeterministic because of its quantum dynamics. Whether this is an ontological indeterminism or not is another topic. This is one of the main aspects of adding a quantum field to the potential. This is one of the main scientific themes of my dissertation, but it's not the only one. The other theme comes from the other aspect of adding a quantum field to the potential. This added field, in turn, opens the possibility to change the hopeless fate of our universe to the one with hope.
Hooray!
The new term in this potential then will have profound significance for our theological hope, for the eschatological possibilities
Yeah.
of the
we see
physical
that.
far future.
Yeah.
Some theologians have been concerned about the hopeless fate of the universe because it apparently looked contradictory to traditional Christian
Yes, it
eschatology.
does, right?
Assuming that there is no way to change this fate, Bob even suggested an idea, which I think is brilliant, that the challenge is not actually from science, but from a philosophical assumption we bring to science, namely that the future will be what science predicts. Instead, Bob argued that if God chooses to act in a new way, the future will not be what science predicts. And then the freeze or fry predictions for cosmological future will not happen. His main point was that this is not a contradiction of physics, but of the philosophical assumption due to Hume that the laws of physics must be obeyed. They have ontological status. Meanwhile, for Christian theology, the laws of physics are merely reflections of God's action as an ongoing creator. And if God wants to create something new in the far future, that is not in contradiction with science, only with Humean philosophical assumption. This is from Bob, not from me. I think this is an excellent idea. that could confront the challenge of the hopeless fate of the universe. But I am now suggesting that we might not even need to be concerned about the fate of the universe, as we could change the irritating assumption that there is no way to change the hopeless fate of the universe according to the laws of physics that have been taken for granted for a long time. In my opinion, it will be more than meaningful to look for new possibilities, new possible future universe scenarios that were not allowed before, but are now allowed to harmonize with traditional Christian eschatology. This new possibility was never imagined by the standard Christian cosmology, popularized since the 1970s, which I think was the reason that Bob did not count this possibility when he proposed his own solution to overcome the challenge of the fate of the universe. But now, I am examining this new possibility by introducing a seemingly negligible term into the physical equation that describes the dynamics of the universe. Isn't it striking that adding a simple mathematical term that looks negligible to the original equation could change the hopeless fate of the universe to the one with a hope that has not ever been imagined? This could be true not only of general relativity, but also of quantum mechanics, if it turns out that some second-order terms could be added to its equation. Now, maybe I answered the question rather indirectly, but this was the best way I could imagine to answer the question given to me. What would remain when quantum mechanics is surpassed scientifically? And how is this relevant to our theme today? I'm pretty sure now you also have an answer to this question. Almost everything will remain the same, but it will dramatically change the world itself in which we live in a way we could never imagine only with quantum mechanics. And this could be more than relevant both to philosophy and theology. Thank you.
This convergence of quantum mechanics and general relativity means that both get surpassed, right? It's not just quantum mechanics,
Right.
but general relativity. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and also I was focusing on the general relativity part in my dissertation. So I just wanted to give that as an example,
Yeah.
what would happen if quantum mechanics is surpassed in the future. Yeah.
And this isn't my field of study, but is the data that we're getting from James Webb, is this part of what we're seeing in terms of differences in the quantum field then?
Right.
Or, okay.
Yeah, so actually that's a very relevant empirical data we are collecting now to see if there is a way to introduce the quantum field dynamics into the original general relativity equation. So, yeah.
So one thing I think you doing, which I find really interesting, is you're not proposing a unified general relativity and quantum mechanics scenario. We don't have it yet.
Yeah. That's
You're
different.
saying,
Yeah.
you're saying a first step is to take general relativity as it was classically given, and then add quantum field theory.
Exactly, yes.
And so it doesn't change but that's new for me, and I appreciate it.
So yeah, actually I think that's a good point. So actually I'm I'm interested in quantum gravity as well,
Right.
but it has nothing to do with quantum gravity at this
Oh,
stage.
Yes.
that's-
So
okay.
I'm introducing quantum field dynamics, but it does not change the basic structure of general relativity.
Right.
So it's about general relativity, but I just introduced some specific field dynamics in it so that it can have different directions.
Does your quantum mechanics that you're adding to general relativity require the Copenhagen interpretation?
Actually, no, because as Bob said, Copenhagen interpretation is a philosophical interpretation.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is separated. It should be separated from the physical either Copenhagen interpretation or Bohemian interpretation.
Good, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So just a statement of support. What you say would have seemed to me in the 70s and 80s when I was reading my PhD to be really strange, I mean, really, kind of like nonsense, because you either have a universe described with general relativity with quantum mechanics inside it, as part of it, or you have a quantum gravity theory of the universe. And you're giving a third option, which would have sounded like an oxymoron. Right? Nobody ever talked about that. I mean, of course, I wasn't in theoretical physics doing this problem, so I can't say nobody was. But it certainly wasn't the physics I learned from the iotropic general relativity.
Actually, the reason why we could do this, so maybe I think I should make it more clear to talk about that. So actually, the reason why it is plausible to bring quantum field dynamics, even avoiding the conflict between general relativity and quantum
Right.
mechanics, is that general relativity assumes, actually general relativity is all about the interaction between matter and space-time. And one thing we know from particle physics is that matter is composed of particles, and that those particles are now described by quantum field dynamics. So that's how quantum field dynamics could be naturally introduced into general relativity, because general relativity itself has particles, and the particles should be described by quantum field dynamics. So that's how quantum field dynamics is naturally introduced in the equation, in the general relativity equation.
Good. That's great. And so you're the first person I know to think of the theological implications of that. That's really wonderful.
Thank you.
Good. I think we should get Philip on.
All right, hey, Andrew, that was beautifully done.
Thank you.
That's a great contribution to our discussion. So these few minutes represent for me far more than a paper. They're an attempt for me to express where 3 decades of work in science and theology has taken me, and to acknowledge both my dependence on my teacher from the person who launched me into the field, and also a place where my fundamental theological intuitions differ. Or are they philosophical intuitions? We'll find out. And I'm excited. I put a lot of thought into this, and I do want to acknowledge that there was a gentleman named Chick Darpino who dialogued with me about this earlier today for 2 hours, and that brought some insights that made this paper different than it would have been, than it was before that happened. So I want to say that out loud. Even though I'm not going to be mentioning extraterrestrial intelligences anywhere in this talk. I'm so sorry. Ted's going to walk out. I'm not going to summarize the physics, but make comments about it. I think that our conversation afterwards may lead us into details, or not. I'm not sure yet. And I want to say out loud at the beginning of the talk, again, thank you to Bob, who has had a formative influence on my own work in science and theology from the beginning. And I'm grateful for this opportunity, so to Braden and CTNS, to try to formulate a new synthetic position that tries to capture what I've learned across my career in this field. And Professor Ted Peters may smile to find me, trained by his fellow Lutheran theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg, closer to some of the core intuitions he's had about this topic and has brought to my attention repeatedly, usually in print through the years or in front of large audiences. So I start with the thing that I most, well, if I had to name a single commitment for my science and theology work, it would be creative mutual interaction. And that is for me everything about what makes our field valuable, a valuable contribution. It means listening in 2 directions. It means learning, actually mastering fields in 2 directions. It means the commitment never to stop that dialogue. It means a love of questions and criticisms that I think you guys have actually demonstrated today as you've interacted to make things more strong. You've been engaged in creative mutual interaction, and your vision is that that would constitute a science-religion dialogue or a science and Christian theology dialogue of the sort that we'd really want to be a part of. I can't say anything more defining for my approach to the field than that term of creative mutual interaction.
Thank you, Phil.
And I want to add that, and this is good since CTNS received many millions of dollars from Sir John Templeton, that was a commitment that he had. He never wanted the holy scriptures to trump science. He wanted science to supplement the beautiful ancient scriptures, but not just leave them aside. And keeping those both in a creative mutual interaction, in a sense, to me, you named the intention of Sir John. I think that's also cool. I also owe to you, Bob, a philosophical insight. So although I won't be talking so much about this book, I'll talk about where I've moved since that book. The philosophical insight that you stressed, and that many of us who were arguing positions this, and actually in the earlier volumes as well, remains indispensable, and it's going to be the core of this talk. Namely, free will and an interaction, and in fact niota, non-interventionist objective divine action, both require some actual openness in the fabric of natural causality. That is, any niota, but actually any sense of human freedom, and I would actually say the meaningfulness of human existence qua human, requires that we don't have a physical universe with strict determinism. Because on my view, you can't have that and then somehow introduce freedom somewhere further up the scale, say the moment that God places a soul in a fetus at the moment of conception, to take the 1912 Catholic Encyclopedia position. That could only be dualistic, theologically dualistic and dualistic in terms of mind and matter. And that's a view that makes creative mutual interaction impossible. So in a sense, it's a corollary of creative mutual interaction that the physics has to offer the space for everything that we say occurs later on in the process. It doesn't have to be, and perhaps can't be, just an arbitrary universe where things just happen. So stochastic, probabilistic is sufficient. And that's also a point you've made, and I think that remains accurate. And as a person who's spent several decades working on emergence theories in multiple disciplines, I'd now say it turns out that the physical laws that make the sciences of physics and chemistry possible have to be stochastic in that sense. If they aren't, then biochem and the formation of the first biological agents, simple unicellular organisms swimming through some sort of liquid, right, with a little flagellum, a little chemical motor, we would have to understand them as purely deterministic, right? Yeah, automatons is good, right? And therefore, everything further up would be deterministic. So we have to stick with it. And I don't know if you use this phrase, but the phrase I often attribute to you, I'll have to look up what you actually said. The universe is fundamentally open at the bottom. So there's just a way in which it doesn't rest on some deterministic structure, and then you have the evolution of life and culture and the rest. It actually has to be the way that we currently think it is. And if this future quantum mechanics doesn't have a space for that, a deterministic quantum field theory, which we think is impossible, I actually think we have good reasons to think it couldn't be, but if that turned out to be a wrong assumption, then everything I say here, and I would say the history of our work at CTNS wouldn't hold, because it's really based on that. So that is, that's crucial. Now, here's where the divergence begins to happen. We worked really hard in quantum mechanics for a lot of years. We made all of us learn a lot of quantum mechanics and philosophy of quantum mechanics and theology based on that all the way through. The content of the understanding of agency has to come from elsewhere. And we have to find a way to build in that priority in how we describe the project as a whole. I think that's the thesis. So we already have fundamental laws and processes of the physical world, not fully deterministic. Niota is possible. The compatibility of science and theology in the form of the CTNS school has offered, holds. Christian theology is sufficient. But here's where I've come down. I want to call all the work that we've done in quantum mechanics a precondition for a theory of divine action, not a theory of divine action. So I can't use the phrase on this position, a quantum level theory of divine action. I have to say, or I would say, the fact that the determinism fails at the quantum level is the condition of the possibility of divine action. but we don't yet have that theory. Or more strongly, and I think I'm going to argue this, it'll be interesting to get to in the debate, divine action could not be recognized at the quantum level. Or maybe a different way to put it, but I think it's right also, the necessary terms and concepts for a theory of divine action are not yet present at the quantum level, or in fact at the level of physics. So when I concentrated so much on the mechanisms of the theory of quantum level divine action, I was wrong. Unfortunately, a person writing a book at Cambridge University Press decided to point this out in a lot of detail. So Sarah and Elaine Ritchie in 2019 published with Cambridge Divine Action and the Human Mind, and took me on as the primary example of a mistaken approach to divine action that focused on causal mechanisms. And really attacking the causal mechanisms approach as effectively as she did is what began a years-long process of reflection that goes public today for the first time. No, that's not quite true. Nonetheless, and this part I don't handle in this particular paper, that the interconnections that you in particular, Bob, describe in today's quantum entanglement, and you've written about it before and many of us have, that interconnection should and can play a role in understanding divine action as one moves to more complex systems. So I want to hold on to that for two reasons. One, it's an interconnection that helps us understand the interconnection of God and world later on. And second, it suggests that there may be other features that first emerge at the quantum level that, as we move up through the disciplines, through the process of emergence, take different forms and become essential, just as the fundamental openness becomes essential. Right? So it could be that even the things you said today are one sample of a set of phenomena or basic conditions that arise first in the study of quantum mechanics that turn out to play an indispensable role for a Christian theologian advocating iota and looking at what science reveals to us about the nature of God.
Right.
So, but I haven't touched that in this particular paper. So, next thesis, now I'll move on. We need, if quantum mechanics or physics as a whole isn't sufficient to give us a theory of divine action or an understanding of divine action, we need biology to get closer to such a theory. Namely, we need a biology understood through the process of emergence. I'm going to not repeat things that I've said before about emergence because I want to stay on the area of the new, what I'm trying out here. Okay, what I recognize in preparing for today is that the openness that quantum mechanics reveals, causal openness, stochastic non-determinism, is what makes strong emergence possible. And Arthur Peacock never said that so clearly, and I don't think I said that as clearly as I should have. But I think you've seen that. So what I call Bob's insight, right, the role of quantum indeterminacy for understanding the entire process of iota across the disciplines. Your insight is what makes strong emergence possible. Let me just say a word about that because it's really important and it's new. Weak emergence is basically a kind of reductionism to physics with epistemic limitations. So it is a kind of reductionism down to physical explanations. Microphysical is what some of the people say. But it just says, well, because of emergence, we just can't know all of that. Sometimes complexity, pruning algorithms, there are a bunch of ways to say how knowledge is limited. But weak emergentism still has the causal arrows pointing downward. And we saw that in the debates that Nancy Murphy was involved in one of the volumes when we did the Philosophy of Mind in 2002 at Pope John Paul II's little home in, was it Poland? Yeah. One street leading through, hay being cut along the fields, 3 cardinals sitting in on the meetings and some brilliant philosophers of mind and neuroscientists. Right, but I think they showed that it really would represent, a weak emergence would represent a fundamentally reduction view of human thought to the brain and from the brain all the way down, right, to physical systems. Strong emergence, made possible by the fundamental nature of the universe that we know from quantum mechanics, allows for emergent forms of causation, including agential causation. And that's only possible because you have only stochastic outcomes, and they can be influenced by part-whole causation this is something that Arthur Peacock worked out first in my knowledge, and then that became central for my work and got built into some of the CTNS Vatican Observatory volumes. So I'll skip this lovely logic of emergence that we can follow from that basis to the more complex systems of solid-state physics, to physical chemistry, which chemistry, who is it? Pierluigi said is the discipline, the science of emergence par excellence. And I just think that's fascinating. It's in chemistry, and you began to hint at that when you're in part of your paper here. And then we can follow that to the emergence of biochemistry and biological agents in a paper with Stuart Kaufman. I think one of the most significant papers I ever published. We argued that it would be impossible in principle to reduce the agents of Darwinian causation to anything lower than the biological system. And he said, his phrase that he brought to that paper was that it is, there is no way to even describe a possibility space using the concepts of physics and chemistry that would be able to offer a framework for Darwinian evolutionary processes. That's a long argument, but that's strong emergence. There's a break there, which is made possible by what we know about the fundamentals of physics. And we can do that. And then we love to follow that through from the emergence of biological agents to ones with central nervous system, to ones with a rudimentary or reptilian brain, to ones with more complex brain and a theory of other minds, to humans with the use of language and symbolic systems, Terry Deacon, and all the way up to humans who sense the presence of God and pray and live lives oriented toward a being that's not a part of this universe but beyond it also altogether. That's the ladder of emergence. Okay, what is this causality then? Biological causation or causality is already agential causation even at the very bottom. So we've argued that, and this is biosemiotics and Jasper and others that we could go into, but the simplest unicellular organism should be understood as a proto-agent, and that we can develop a continuity from that point on in a way that we couldn't about any chemical or physical state that is pre. Then we find groups of animals involved in group selection. That's another form of causation. So what I'm trying to give you is a sense of the richness of types of causation that occur purely in the sciences, because of the next step I want to take about divine action. Influence of a theory of other minds is huge. Like, I know that you look bored now. I know that, whatever. We are constantly imagining what the others are thinking and then using our big brains to try to figure out how to act strategically in light of that. Whether to avoid being killed or to find a mate or whatever it might be, protect our children. The influence of culture, the influence of broader ideas, the influence of religious ideas and practices. Like, we have huge range of types of causal influence in human experience. All possible because of that foundation. If it weren't that way, we couldn't make sense of them except just, reductively. And at this point, I want to say, even before you introduce anything theological, there's still the possibility of a top-down influence. This is the way Arthur Peacock liked to say it, of the divine or some broader force on the universe as a whole. He didn't want to call it causation, but some sort of influence. And I want to say that even philosophically, without a bunch of theological assumptions, you could make sense of that. Okay, now I want to move on and close with divine action. And my criterion for successful Christian theory of divine action is a story told by a Korean pastor who walked into my office once at Claremont School of Theology and said that she had been working with, what is the word of translation of the Korean term? Comfort women, were Korean women taken into sexual slavery for the occupying Japanese soldiers. I think the English phrase is comfort women, but I don't remember for sure how that was described.
The Korean translation was Ryandu.
Ryandu, yeah, that's what it is.
Yes.
So these women came back from what for a Korean or an Asian is an unbelievably, as bad as that would be for any woman in the world, but add on top the Confucian and the shame culture and so forth, who came back from that, married husbands, these were all Christian women, so spent their lives in churches. And when they were in their 80s, this young Korean woman pastor came and asked, could we talk about your experience? And she said that they opened up in an unbelievable way. And they, for the first time in their lives, said things maybe their husbands, their children didn't know. They'd never spoken to a human being. And they had suffered for 50 years. And she just happened to have the privilege of interviewing these women personally. And she came in, as one of my students, she came in, moved at the edge of tears, and so grateful that she was able to write down. I said, what's the main thing that they told you? And they said that they were aware for decades of the comfort of the Spirit of God. That was their primary experience. Unable to talk to anybody in a Confucian shame-based culture. There was no psychotherapist, nobody they could talk to, except a pastor, a young pastor who came to ask them. And they said they knew the presence of the Spirit all the time. That is a form of causation. And I think of John 14, I will go, but the Spirit will come, the Spirit of comfort. Peace I leave with you, my peace I bring to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Therefore be not afraid. That, I want to say, is the minimal necessary criterion for a Christian theory of divine action. If it can't meet that criterion, if those women were in illusion that God's presence was there and the Spirit was comforting them, then the position is not Christian. So that's the standard I would hold.
Is that an empirical standard or
No, that's normative. So I'm claiming that the Christian theologian has to answer. We know over 50% of the people in the 20th century who called themselves theologians didn't meet that standard. Boltmann or whoever you want to mention.
Yeah.
Okay, so now my thesis to bring all this together. I think that we can get to that criterion best through a deeper understanding of double agency. So, and this I'll close with this. Double agency means two agents together bring about a result. And here we're talking about a theological agency, so God and a human agent together bring about a result. And I think I'm going to argue it's essential for understanding divine action in a Nyota context. Non-interventionist, objective divine action. So that's something I'm exploring for the first time. Thanks to Chip pushing me on this. Okay. I want to avoid the primary versus secondary approach to double agency, the Thomistic, neo-Thomistic view, without saying any words about that. And I want to think of the levels of a double agency. So it turns out it's not just one concept, but it's a series of levels, and I actually think that's essential for understanding this. So I was trying to get to 10, I only got to 6, but let's start at the bottom. Okay, I'll take some human examples to try to make it clear. Mom, dad, the parents say, kids, clean the kitchen. And so Debbie goes into the kitchen from 1 to 2, and she cleans half of it. Let's imagine they're twins, they're always doing this, right? And then Ted goes in from 3 to 4 and cleans the kitchen. Parents walk in the evening and say, thanks kid for cleaning the kitchen. Double agency, they weren't in the room at the same time, they hardly spoke to each other, but they got the kitchen cleaned. Lowest level, right? Now let's move on. I'm going to skip quickly. The crossing of the Red Sea in the Hebrew Bible account. So human agents flee in front of the Egyptians following Moses, come to the Red Sea. God, on the account, opens up a pathway through the water. That's the divine agency. Humans run through. God lets the water close on the Egyptian soldiers. All right, that's a kind of double agency. So both groups were involved in doing things, but separately, right? A little bit better than cleaning the kitchen, but nonetheless, okay? Now, let me just do 3 and briefly. So number 4 might be comfort. So God helps an agent to keep emotional trauma at bay so that she can carry out her actions in the world. Okay, that's closer, right? 3, a great religious artist, a great Christian artist. God contributes to the creative process, opens up the person's senses toward creativity, but without removing the artist's agency. She actually draws the painting, composes the music. The Alleluia chorus, right? Handel said, the butler comes in the morning, he's just finished the Alleluia chorus, and he says, I had visions of angels descending and rising to heaven, right? But we don't want to say that God dictated in notes. We want to say Handel came up with those. But the vision and the support, right, the creative process. Do the same now, number 2, with the great saints. God contributes to the saintliness, but they're the agents who achieve this point of godlikeness. And now, as the highest level of double agency, and then I'd read this back across the whole story, is Luke 22. And I'll just take it as given now, and we can fight the textual battles later with our New Testament colleagues. Jesus tells the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane to stay awake and pray. He goes some distance from the disciples. He enters into prayer and says, God, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And then it says, and he prayed, it's sweat or drops of blood, falling from him. This absolute, okay, let's imagine that at that time, God provides the strength to go through with what Jesus had somehow known he would always have to do. And yet the agent, Jesus, carries on the actions between them, the crucifixion, the scourging, the dragging of the cross, crucifixion itself, the 7 last words, and death. It's an incredible divine contribution without removing Jesus' agency as a human being. And I want to say that Luke 22 is the quintessence of double agency, which is a fusing. I'm going to just take a traditional Christian view and say the perfect fusing of human and divine will in an action, an attitude, and results. I want to say that that's the most fruitful way, this ladder, to think about non-interventionist subjective divine action. And the highest level of double agency is fusion. In fact, theologically, we would understand that from understanding the Trinity, where the fusion is already ontological, 3 persons in one being or essence or substance, right? Each one cooperating in all the actions, that's the traditional view, right? In all the actions that God takes. And yet, there's an agential specificity for the actions of Spirit, of Jesus, of God the Father and Creator, each of those. So I think it's fun to take the Trinity notion and read back from that to the perfect fusion of human and divine will, through which our presence is the Spirit of Christ in John 14, and Jesus is called the firstborn of all creation. So now a model for anthropology and the content of what the Spirit presence is in the Christian tradition. In conclusion, this kind of agency wouldn't be possible, human agency and this double agency, wouldn't be possible if the physical world were fully deterministic. We'd have to be dualists, Cartesians presumably. I've reversed the arrow of influence. Bob works from, in the series anyway, not in some of your other books like Alpha, but anyway, from the quantum mechanical insight to biology, like in the evolution volume in the CTNS series. I work from the understanding of double agency that involves humans and God, back to animals with certain limitations, back to the most simple biological agents, and so forth. So divine action, as I understand it, is understood from divine human interactions backwards in time to the most primitive agents. But the conditions that make this whole process possible are understood from the fundamental conditions and laws of the physical world, moving forward then in cosmological time. At the end of the day then, maybe Pannenberg's idea of 2 epochs, the incursion of the end of history into the middle of history might be another way of understanding 2 different epochs. Did I satisfy the condition of the Korean women? I think so. Did I preserve an iota? I think so. Do I need Bob's arguments about fundamental indeterminacy? Yes. Is this view that I affirm for divine agency consistent with science? Yes, under these conditions, strong emergence. Is it adequate to the needs of Christian theology for it to be, say, is it in sufficient condition with the continuity with the Christian tradition? Yes. And what are its weaknesses? We're about to find out.
Very nice, Phil.
As always.
Thanks.
So I have a question. I really appreciate what you said. Very moved by it. You need to think about it. guess it would help me, because I've struggled with it, saying, nevertheless, thy will be done.
Mm.
That has always seemed to me to be an oppositional view. Jesus has his wishes, but he lets him go in surrender to God's wishes. So of course, in a sense, that's cooperation or acting together, but it's an acting in which his agency is taken away in order to let God's agency be effective. But I don't think that's what you want to say.
No.
So help me with my.
Yeah, it's a great question, because you're digging down immediately into the core of the idea.
And that's how it's always been a problem for me.
Yeah.
It's always been a problem.
So the artist, go back one step. The artist says, Handel says, I want to write this concluding Schlusschoral, the Alleluia chorus. I'm just so tired, right? And prays, let's just imagine, this is probably not true, and has the strength to continue without the content being taken from him. Jesus says in utter honesty, I mean, I just imagine the complete honesty with Abba, Father, I wish this wouldn't happen. Please, just take this cup from me. I don't want to taste this poison, right? And then what God provides, not is taking away the decision to move forward, but the possibility, that extra support, so that Jesus' will and God's will, out of that, are perfectly aligned. Nevertheless, not my selfish, tired, afraid will happen, but may what my will perfectly fuse with yours. And it's an affirmation of faith for me that they did perfectly fuse.
Thank you.
So it supplements Jesus' agency to the point of making the fusion possible.
Thank you. It's really helpful.
Yeah, in a virtue perspective, I would say that would be infused virtue.
Yes.
And that God is,
Oh, nice.
giving,
Yes.
In that instance, probably infused theological and infused moral virtue.
Exactly.
And that
Good.
was it.
That's really helpful. I had not even thought of it from virtue theory.
Now, I thought I heard you say you're a non-dualist. So, how can you speak about the Korean women feeling comfort from the Spirit and Jesus gaining something from this prayer with the Father in non-dualist terms?
Yeah. So this I took on in Mind and Emergence, some time ago, and I argued that strong emergence is not a dualist position. I still think that's accurate. But at the end of the book, when I talked about this debate that Arthur and I were having, the openness toward the divine of the natural world as a whole, and I cannot construe God as a further projection from the natural world and still be in continuity with the Christian tradition.
Okay.
So that would be the view of many of the emergentists. Samuel Alexander wrote Space-Time and Deities, 1917 to 19, and had 7 levels of emergence, all consciousness of all beings as level 6, and then, no, that was level 7, the emergent consciousness of all conscious beings, and that represented God. And that's not going to do it. So if I want anything stronger than that, in a sense, Samuel Alexander named what emergence would, an emergentist theology in pure form, and I broke with that. And I said, so the cost might be that my opponents will say, you are a theological dualist. And I would say, well, definitely not in the bad senses of theological dualism, if I might say, since we're not being recorded, C.S. Lewis's Miracles book, right? But if you want to call that dualist, in order for me to be able to speak of divine agent not derived from the human world, then that's a cost I have to pay.
Yeah, okay. Gotcha.
I'm curious how far we can push double agency in your view, because at this point, what I'm hearing is that it's human and divine, or would be the 2 agents in this case. What happens if either by evolution or by technology we acknowledge that there are other beings that are capable of freedom and being able to have true agency in the world?
So AI.
AI or other primates or something else that evolves that it's also capable of.
ETI.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of ways. You know, we can go transhumanism, we can go ATI, we can go AI, we can go animal rights. I mean, there's you know all those I think are off the ground.
That's a brilliant question. Great. And I think we should say we keep the term double agency in the broadest sense of two agents or two types of agent working together. So there's double agency when a dog helps save a drowning person from the water, and kind of by tugging at the shirt gives the person that enough hope and energy to do that last shove to get their head out of the water and live. There's definitely double agency between humans in artistic creation, in parenting, in human intimacy. I mean, there are many ways in which that double agency occurs. There's a kind of double agency in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, except on the basis of una substantia, right? So I think we should take, and there can be a double agency. I mean, this is a kind of double agency between my computer, and this is not AI. This is not generalized artificial intelligence. So I think we have multiple examples of that. It'd be fun. Nobody's ever written a generalized book on double agency, philosophically speaking, and then seen the Christian case as a special case. I'd love. I mean, maybe that's what I have to do next.
Great idea.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Do you guys want to step, I don't know where we're on time, step back and do, 13 minutes. Do you want to step back and do a kind of synthetic discussion? With 3 papers have been read. Ted's jumped in at various points. Braden said a few things. Do you want to just sort of where does the whole day take us? You know, we're doing this for posterity 50 years from now. This will be a worldwide YouTube hit.
Before we do the synthesis, I just have a really big question that I've been wrestling with.
Good.
And Bob knows about this, but you can really help me with this one. When Robert Sapolsky or anybody argues against free will, what they do is they say, we have to ask the question, is the universe determined or not determined? And to argue against free will, they say it's determined. Ergo, no free will exists. And I'm always bothered this because we experience free will. It's the job to explain it, not explain it away. All right. So, I want to start with the determined universe. And on the free will issue, I say, well, there's such a thing as a human self, and the human self determines things. You use the sentient beings do that. Well, that's true. My dog Angie determines things, and the cells in her body determine things. So you can have a determined world, and you can have all of this agency within the world in a deterministic fashion. Okay. I'm happy with what I've decided there. You can demolish it, but I'm happy with that position. Now I want to move to, would that work for God's agency as well? And at that point I get kind of stuck, because Bob Russell has enunciated this axiom over the years that I've taken to be the case, that unless there's some causal openness, to use your phrase, we can't really account for God's action in the world. But I wonder, help me on this, Bob's answer I know is no, but is there a way in which, by analogy, human free will in a determined universe could, by analogy, say something about God's action in a determined universe? Or is that a blind alley?
Can I give you a partial answer to the first part of the question? So first you said that the universe is determined, the assumption. We can ask if that is really true. So as I already told.
You're right in asking that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So of course general relativity is a deterministic theory. So in that sense,
that's right.
It might be true to say that the history of the universe has already been determined. However, as I said, there is something that could be introduced, which is quantum physics. So quantum field dynamics is quantum. So it's not a deterministic theory. So we have something indeterministic that could be introduced in the dynamics of the universe. In that sense, I think we cannot say that the universe is for sure determined.
Mhm.
The history of the universe
Right.
might be indeterministic rather than deterministic.
Yes,
That would
yes.
be one answer. And the other answer we can have is that, so as Philip said, if we think about the strong emergence, then there is a break. So, for example, we have physics, but we have chemistry, over physics. And if they are connected to each other causally, then maybe this deterministic nature should be followed by the upper level, for example, chemistry. However, if we assume that there is a kind of break,
Yeah,
then even if the lower level has a deterministic nature,
Mhm.
the upper level would not have that deterministic nature. So there is a place for indeterminism as well there.
so if I heard you correctly, so you'd have indeterminism, not necessarily at the lowest level, but at the level where emergence occurs.
Right. So even if the lower level is deterministic, actually
Yeah.
I don't believe it is true. But even if the
If
lower
it's
level
not.
is
So there are
deterministic,
two arguments for indeterminism.
right?
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So in that sense, I think it is really important to
All right.
dig into the detail about the.
I know, but I want to go right into the devil's den.
I appreciate you for a hard question.
I thought that was while we were drinking wine in this. So I want to answer your question with a question. Which problem do you think is harder? Humans being agents in a deterministic world, or God being agents, being personal God, in a deterministic theological framework?
Well, right
Right,
now,
Calvin.
the second is harder for me.
Okay, say more about that.
Well, again, I think the free will is a slam dunk because you can observe cells or other sentient beings becoming agents in the world, and it doesn't change a deterministic presupposition. Doesn't change it. It just changes what the agent is, but it doesn't change determinism. And I've always admired Bob's view that of Nyota, but he starts with the assumption that Bohr and Heisenberg are right. I want to start with the assumption that David Bohm is right.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I get there? Bob says, Ted, give it up, you know.
No, I don't.
But I want to fight till the last moment for this. Now, what David Bohm does, I think, and I don't want to waste everybody's time on this, but which David Bohm is different from Newton. Newton's got this closed causal nexus, but for Bohm, you've got time, you've got movement, you've got flow, you've got change. A deterministic system over time with change.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that that deterministic system ought to have room for A, free will, B, divine action of the Nyota type. I just want to see if that could be made coherent. I haven't made it coherent, but I'd like to make it coherent if possible. If you can help me, good. And if this gets us away from the primary
No, this is great. I
agenda.
love this question, actually.
Yeah.
So in a deterministic world, of the complexity of a David Bohm kind of
Yeah.
model,
Yeah.
I'll just state it as a thesis, but without taking all the time. It's a compatibilist theory of free will.
Right.
So I did it, I had to do it,
Yeah.
but I willed to do it, and therefore we call it free.
Right.
That's the Harry Frankfurt
Mhm.
view. And I find that inadequate for understanding freedom as we classically use it.
Would it be, would a compatibilist view like that be adequate for divine action or?
Yeah, no, that's the main question I want to get to.
Yeah.
But I do, of all the issues I've ever written on, the freedom has been the most interesting. And
Yeah.
I wrote a book in quest of freedom,
Mhm.
question of emergence of spirit in the biological world, and tried to argue that that wouldn't be sufficient, but in the increase in complexity, so just measure it as we could do it in physical systems or biological systems, and up to human systems with culture and language, it is an asymptote. So we never reach, if this is
Yeah,
freedom,
right.
we get closer and closer, but never touch it.
Yeah.
But the two become quantitatively indistinguishable. I have virtually infinite number of things that I can say in the next sentence. I can
Mhm.
scream at
Right.
God, or I can remember my mother, or whatever. But I can't say that I have my own causal action, scientifically speaking. But at that point, you can do into what the Kant and the followers call the philosophy of as if. It makes sense for me to act as if I'm free,
Yeah.
because there's no quantitative difference between the range of possible
Yeah,
actions I have in the
right,
next
right,
sentence
right, yeah.
and having actually a spirit.
Yeah.
Now, theologically, it can come down from the other direction. And I say that that weakens the pain of the compatibilist position, which does not give us
alright,
freedom
thank
as
you.
well.
Yeah.
So that on the human side. But on the theological side, why wouldn't we want to be theological determinists? God always acts consistent with God's nature. God is essentially good. Therefore, every
Right.
action of God is by nature good. God has access to all information, so God's informational basis is accurate. God takes that basis and God's divine values and takes an action. It's totally determined. If you had an infinite computer, you could program it, right? Therefore, what do we lose about God? And even if it had to be the case that who, although he was in the form of man, in a form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself.
Yeah.
If that were an essential part of the divine nature, as essentially compassionate and kenotic, what would we lose in the Christian proclamation?
Mhm.
I'm asking you as a theologian. I struggle with this question.
Is one of the implications that the whole of the physical world then would be governed by secondary causation?
We don't know how God, from that amount, my theological determinism don't know whether God would create a world with quantum mechanics
Yeah.
or where quantum mechanics turn out to be false.
Mm-hmm.
So I would separate those two questions, but just in terms of the understanding of God, would that God not be worshipful? No, I'd say we could worship that God.
Well, yeah.
Would that God not be moral or omnibenevolent? No, I would say God is. Essential by God's nature. So what all our evangelical analytic philosophers of religion love to do is call themselves Anselmians.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we haven't really had much interaction with them, but are they wrong?
I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. You don't need to answer it now, but in the future. For Pannenberg, God is the all-determining reality. He really is. So I wonder if there's any way of connecting that understanding of God with a deterministic picture of the universe. And I don't have an answer. When you think about one driving home,
I'll just say two sentences. It couldn't be a deterministic understanding of the universe because the causation comes from the end, and so it's pulled toward an outcome which is the divine kingdom.
that's the
of God.
way I think, actually.
So it can't be a deterministic physics if with that openness.
Yeah.
And secondly, he believes that God as die alles bestimmende Wirklichkeit
Yeah, sorry.
is
yeah.
not deterministic in the sense of physical determinism because it comes from the end, the open
That's right.
history.
That's right.
Whether that stands up or not, but he was completely convinced that that is not a deterministic view.
Yeah, I think I have some idea
Go
about
ahead.
that.
Yeah.
So that reminds me of the difference between Bohmian interpretation and Copenhagen interpretation.
Okay.
So what I learned from the difference between Copenhagen interpretation and Bohmian interpretation
Yeah.
is that determinism is actually very close to indeterminism, vice versa. So sometimes, for example,
That's good.
according to the Bohmian interpretation, it is deterministic, as you said. However, we have to keep in mind that it's different from classical determinism.
Yes.
Yes.
That's
Quantum
good. That's good.
determinism.
Yeah.
But, as you said, in some theologians say that God is deterministic, as you said. For example, Pannenberg.
Okay.
Then we have a puzzle.
Mhm.
We have to have an indeterministic nature, but God has deterministic nature. How can we explain that? So maybe the difference between the Bohmian interpretation and Copenhagen interpretation could give us a clue.
Mhm.
So God is deterministic. However, it's not deterministic in a way we used to think. So it's not a classical
Yeah.
Right.
determinism, but it's
Yeah.
a quantum determinism. So it's a different type of determinism that God has. So
Mm.
maybe I think in that way we can have some analogy
Mhm.
from the
That's really helpful.
comparison between
That's really
Bohemian
helpful.
interpretation and Copernican interpretation.
Yeah.
So God is indeterministic, but he is deterministic at the same time. But that determinism is not a classical determinism. It's a
Mhm.
quantum determinism. And God is indeterministic, and it is obviously quantum indeterminism. So I think we can mingle them together.
Well, thank you for these fertile ideas.
Does this return us back to the idea of entanglement then?
Um, not directly, but I think we can connect them all together. Yeah, but of course it's not directly connected to that idea. But yeah,
Oh, I think I can find a principle that if there's some feature of the determinism, allegedly there's some feature of determinisms which make them, we need a negative adjective like non-invalidating or non-classical or something like that. So quantum mechanical determinism, I don't know what the phrase means, but if we had it, determinism from the future, Pannenberg said, is different from one from the past. That infinite number of range of possible next behaviors. I can't prove that you have a free soul, but it's quantitatively indistinguishable. So maybe there are a bunch of areas where the adjective before deterministic system
and they are qualitatively different from
makes
each
it
other.
qualitatively
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant insight. I'd never thought of that before.
I think you want to say asymptotic incident.
Yeah, I do. That's what I was going to ask Ju, if we could say that there would be a kind of asymptote.
Yes.
Could we construct your example as something getting so close to that y-axis that they become indistinguishable? It's 0.9999 continuous, roughly equals, so curvy equal sign 1.
Because you're using an exponential.
Yeah, right,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys can do it with the math, but if we could make that case that many of these systems are asymptotic in that same way, we'd have the answer.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I need to think about that in more detail. I think we could have something very meaningful
Yeah,
from thinking about that. Yeah.
because I can't, like, if you could describe quantum determinism in a way that's analogous to the virtual infinity of options, behavioral options that humans have.
Actually, Bohemian interpretation already includes that.
Does it?
Something like that.
Huh?
Because actually the difference between quantum determinism and classical determinism is that classical determinism has only one entity involved, but quantum determinism, they have many different entities altogether, and they are interacting with each other.
Got it, got
So
it.
in that sense, I think that is very similar to what you're saying now.
So it's sort of computationally becomes asymptotic.
Yeah.
You can't pre-state
Yeah,
what the entities are, but the actors are.
yeah, and also as
this
Bob
system.
said, it's a kind of matter of interpretation. So 3D, so transitioning from 3D space to 3n space, and so n entities to one entity, so something like that. So
Mhm.
I think that has some relationship with each other. Yeah.
That's a breakthrough for me.